Today I'm doing a haul, and that is a haul of my new style that I want to evolve into, which is an emo style. I want an all black wardrobe, so I'm going emo, and I start off with a lot of eyeliner, but I know there's a lot that I need to know. There's so many buttons and holes. I don't know if I can handle this emo lifestyle.
The 2000s emo aesthetic was a global cultural force, shaping the wardrobes of an entire generation who made their feelings fashionable. It began roughly in 2001, peaked in the mid-2000s, and declined a little bit after 2010. And while it was deeply rooted in the alternative music scene, it evolved far beyond its origins, becoming a universal symbol of vulnerability and rebellion, and remaining one of the most visually impactful aesthetics that still undergoes reinvention to this day. Background. To understand how emo exploded in the 2000s, we've got to take a look at the history of the music genre, which many scholars believe can be broken down into three waves. The first wave began in 1985 during Washington DC's Revolution Summer, a movement in the hardcore punk scene that wanted to reshape the scene's violent reputation. Bands like Embrace and Rites of Spring combined hardcore punk's fast, aggressive sound with melodic guitar and deeply personal lyrics. And unlike traditional punk, which focused on political and social issues, these bands turned inward, exploring emotional experiences and often moving audiences to tears. People in this scene were labelled emotional hardcore, or emo-core, which was hated by musicians who thought it was insulting, akin to calling them whiny.
I must say, emo-core must be the stupidest fucking thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
And this rejection of the term emo has been present in each generation of bands ever since. But whether they like it or not, it's stuck. The second wave of emo in the 1990s evolved the genre and set the stage for its 2000s commercial success. The phenomenon of 90s grunge meant introspective and emotional music was becoming massively popular. And so bands like Jawbreaker, The Promise Ring, Mineral, and Sunny Day Real Estate, just to name a few, combined emo's punk roots with indie influences, which meant more melodic sounds that helped it become more mainstream and spread across the USA. And also the lo-fi nasally vocals that were introduced in this era are so iconically emo now.
Tonight will be the night that I will fall for you.
But the third wave is likely why you're here. It covers emo's commercial breakthrough in the 2000s, starting with Jimmy Eat World's 2001 album Bleed American and its hit single The Middle, which launched emo into the mainstream. Soon after, major record labels began signing emo bands like Dashboard Confessional, Saves the Day, and Taking Back Sunday. These bands produced platinum records, appeared on MTV, and toured alongside pop-punk icons like Green Day and Blink-182. And major labels just couldn't deny the commercial appeal of emo anymore. And so, by the mid-2000s, emo pop, a subgenre of emo blending their emotional lyrics with pop melodies, exploded in popularity. This movement was led by the holy trinity of bands, My Chemical Romance, Fall Out Boy, and Panic at the Disco. These groups achieved insane success, releasing double platinum albums, topping Billboard charts, and embarking on global sold-out tours. Members of these bands became massive celebrities and even teenage heartthrobs. Other bands, such as the All American Rejects, who were a bit more pop than emo, and AFI, who were a bit more hardcore than emo, also thrived. And even Blink-182 embraced the emo wave with their hit I Miss You. Subgenres of emo like screamo, which were led by Alexisonfire, which featured aggressive sounds and screaming vocals, also became massive, and other emo bands like the Red Jumpsuit Apparatus, The Used, and Paramore also became hugely popular, especially Paramore, who had multiple radio charting songs in this period, and an album Riot in 2007, which was certified double platinum. There are several theories that try to explain emo's meteoric rise at this time. Some suggest that the genre's introspective nature resonated with the post-9/11 generation, where protest music was hard to come by and party music seemed inappropriate. I don't really agree with this because I think there was plenty of party music at this time, but yeah, that theory exists. Others have argued that emo filled an angsty void left after grunge's decline. But I don't know, if you ask me, I think it has more to do with the rise of the internet in the 2000s. In her book, Emo, How Fans Defined a Subculture, culture and media academic Dr. Judith Fatala describes how fan interactions with emo bands on popular social media platforms of the time completely shaped the genre's identity. Early emo band websites were often amateurish, creating a sense of intimacy and accessibility. For instance, Panic at the Disco's first About Us page linked to a downloadable Microsoft Word document. And then there was MySpace, which was founded in 2003 and surpassed Google and Yahoo as the most visited website in the USA in the mid-2000s. It also became the blueprint for modern fandom. It allowed bands to directly interact with fans, market tours, and sell merchandise. And fans became unpaid marketers, sharing band-related content on their profiles, and it was for these reasons that MySpace was maybe one of the biggest contributors to how emo got so big so fast. There was also LiveJournal, with its text-based and semi-private format that continued to encourage deep discussions and community building in emo fans. Some of these communities, like Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy Love, became hubs for fanfiction and discussions. And then in the later stages, platforms like Tumblr and YouTube enabled fans to share memes, nostalgic content, and classic YouTube edits of their favourite artists. Basically, the explosion of the internet allowed fans to bypass traditional media gatekeepers and take control of the emo identity. On these platforms, they debated what it meant to be a good emo fan or a bad emo fan, mostly around who just jumped on from the mainstream success and who was there since the beginning, and in a tale as old as time, they either rejected or embraced the term emo. But they also went to these spaces to find the same comfort they found in the music, to build community, discuss mental health, queerness, and gender identity. It created a really strong sense of belonging for those on those websites.
Emo bucket, woo!
Crucially for us, on these platforms they also crafted what it meant to dress emo. MySpace and Tumblr in particular were spaces for aesthetic cultivation of all different kinds. But emo became one of the most popular aesthetics on these platforms. Fans would share fashion inspiration and construct their identities through clothing, and emo teenagers were bound by these fashion norms, as they became central to the subculture's identity. And maybe, without even knowing it, they put styles in place that created an enduring cultural legacy. Clothes. So, as always, before we get into a ridiculously in-depth and over-detailed analysis of items of clothing, let's look at the fashion influences of emo just to contextualize it. There are probably two main fashion influences on the 2000s emo aesthetic: 70s and 80s punk, and Hot Topic. I've talked about 70s and 80s punk on this channel before, and its ongoing influence on fashion remains undeniable. 70s and 80s punk was more than music. It was a fashion revolution aimed at shocking the mainstream. Its DIY aesthetic, ripping, painting, or adorning clothing with unusual objects, emerged as both a rebellion against glamorous disco and a practical choice for its largely working class following. 70s and 80s punk also embraced unisex clothing, deliberately challenging traditional gendered clothing, as all genders often dress similarly. These principles of DIY and unisex clothing carried into emo fashion, though in a more commercialized way. Emo definitely blurred gender lines, with many typical emo outfits looking similar across all genders, and authors Simon and Kelly noted that when buying jeans, boys were told to just see girls. However, unlike punk, 2000s emos leaned into mass-manufactured clothing, reflecting the 2000s fast fashion culture. But interestingly, the commercialization of the emo look was a slow process over time. Original emo bands, coming from the hardcore scene, had a no-nonsense, casual, and plain style to match their raw sound. 90s indie emo embraced vintage, geek, and hipster styles, influenced by Midwestern thrift stores. But the 2000s pop emo boom brought a more polished, mass-market style, largely influenced by Hot Topic. Founded in 1989, Hot Topic began as a Californian retail chain, specializing in countercultural fashion and hard-to-find band merchandise. By the 1990s, it had shifted its focus to alternative youth subcultures, and by the early 2000s, it became the go-to place for aesthetics, music, and merchandise from alternative bands, movies, and TV shows. But the reason it influenced the emo aesthetic so much is it wasn't just a shop for their clothes, it was really tapped into their whole lifestyle. It gave them a place to hang out at the mall and promoted their bands through signing sessions and live performances. I mean, it became so synonymous with goths, vamps, scene kids, and emos that rumours circulated about people entering the store with Bibles for protection. Possibly an urban myth, but I had to mention it. Basically, Hot Topic made alternative styles accessible to suburban teens, and it played a significant role in the commercialisation of alternative subcultures during the 2000s. Emo fashion, in particular, drew heavily from two subcultures whose clothing was available at Hot Topic: more goth and scene. More goth, a late 1990s to early 2000s subculture, emerged from the mainstream commercialization of gothic and nu metal music through bands like Evanescence, Korn, Marilyn Manson, and Slipknot. Hot Topic's gothic clothing, even though mass-produced, appealed to teenagers seeking a dark, brooding aesthetic. While traditional goths criticised more goths for lacking historical and romantic influences in their clothing, the edgy, accessible style resonated with 2000s emo kids, creating a natural crossover between the two subcultures. Scene, on the other hand, actually developed after emo. I'm probably going to be making a video on scene kids next. It just seems like the logical next step after this, so I don't want to go into them too much right now. But basically, they were one of the biggest aesthetics on early social media platforms. Scene kids embraced a mix of electronic, emo, and pop-punk music, and paired childlike Garu-inspired fashion with hardcore punk and goth influences. Hot Topic heavily stocked scene and emo styles, which really blended the two until they were often indistinguishable. It's super important to know that even if people are blending emo and scene styles together these days and just calling it emo, they were definitely different subcultures that had different styles. But because of how closely related they were and the fact that they were all being sold at Hot Topic together meant that we did see some crossovers between them. That doesn't mean they're the same thing though, and God, it annoys me when people think they're the same thing. I need to get offline before I lose my mind. I can't think about this for another second. Okay, so with our aesthetic and context, let's start looking at individual items. The skinny jean is arguably the most essential garment of 2000s emo fashion. While having their golden age, so to speak, in the 50s and 60s, particularly in alternative subcultures like the beatniks, it was mostly 70s and 80s punk skinny jeans that the emo took inspiration from. This item was considered a staple for these subcultures, creating an androgynous look that was often DIY'd to emphasize its alternativeness. For emo, black was the go-to colour, but fashionable variations could feature patterns like stripes, tartan or checks, or bright colours later in the 2000s. And these were often ripped or written on just to emphasize those punk influences. Skinny jeans that created an androgynous silhouette on men were also just insanely popular in the mid to late 2000s in general, partly due to Eddie Sliman's work with Dior Homme, where he paired slim silhouettes with indie music, cementing their status as cool and ubiquitous among musicians. Bondage pants leaned more goth than emo, but were still seen in the aesthetic because of this crossover of influences. Adorned with zippers, straps, chains, rings, and buckles, bondage pants give an appearance of a BDSM style. Originally designed by punk fashion icons Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren in the 1970s, they were a staple of the punk subculture, and their tailored fit was largely considered an anti-fashion statement against the popular flare-style pants of the time. Then, in the late 90s, Trip NYC, founded by alternative fashion icon Dan Goodman in the 1980s, introduced a baggier version which was largely influenced by the era's fat pants. Trip NYC, who had been a key player in the New York punk scene in the 80s, had enormous influence over alternative fashion throughout the 90s. The Trip pant design gained traction in nu metal goth and rave scenes, and by the 2000s had crossed into emo culture, who were heavily influenced by the fashion of goth subcultures. And of course, they were a constant sellout at Hot Topic. I'll point out that skirts and shorts paired with striped knee-high socks occasionally appeared in emo fashion, but these were more aligned with the scene aesthetic, which drew inspiration from Garu styles. For tops, emos favoured graphic t-shirts showcasing their favourite bands or emo-style art. Band tees have been around for a long time and were particularly popular in punk, who also loved a graphic tee with some kind of provocative or anti-establishment message. Meanwhile, emo graphic tees leaned toward gothic or cutesy designs, influenced by more goth and scene subcultures. Hoodies were another essential item, especially if it had an emo-approved band on it, or holes in the sleeves for your thumb to stick through. While hooded clothing is thousands and thousands of years old, the hoodie as we know it originated in the 1930s when Champion created it to keep workers warm in cold warehouses. By the 70s, it gained cultural prominence in hip-hop and sports fashion, which continued into the 80s and 90s, becoming a staple fashion item that carried on into the 2000s. Some think emo gravitated to it as a way to cover their face and body, symbolic of emotional pain and anxiety. I mean, that could be true, but I also think hoodies were just a really popular item for youth in general during this decade. Accessories. The majority of emo accessories came directly from 70s punk fashion. These included checkered or studded belts and chains, like wallet chains, which were often worn on top of or hanging over skinny jeans. 70s punk wore studded belts and chains basically the same way. Interestingly, wallet chains actually have a long history with rebellious subcultures. These include 50s bikers who would use them to secure their wallets while they were riding, as well as 70s and 80s heavy metal enthusiasts or those in hip-hop, more goth, and grunge subcultures. Studded and spiked jewelry of all kinds was another popular accessory. This is a direct nod to punk and goth styles of the 70s and 80s, who would use these spikes and studs to communicate fierceness in their clothing. Other common jewelry items were dog tag, razor blade, and chain necklaces. As dog tags were military items worn by soldiers since the 2nd century for identification, and chains are a common functional item, they have been subverted to symbols of anti-fashion by alternative subcultures for years, especially in punk, of course, who loved wearing dog collars as well. Adorning your wrists with terry cloth sweatbands and stacks of rubber or gel bracelets was another iconic component of 2000s emo fashion. Black gel bracelets were a big part of 80s fashion and were sometimes seen in punk. Rubber bracelets were a massive fad of the 2000s, largely due to the popularity of the Livestrong bracelets, and terry cloth sweatbands were popular in 70s punk fashion, especially on Sid Vicious, as a classic example of punk subverting a popular mainstream accessory of the time. As an emo, if you weren't stacking these bracelets, you were most likely wearing long fingerless gloves, or sometimes you were wearing the bracelets on top of the fingerless gloves. These gloves were especially emo if they were striped, and it wasn't uncommon to see fingerless gloves in punk, as they were subverting a popular utilitarian style associated with sports. But if you ask me, emo gloves are more reminiscent of goth and more goth styles. Other punk-inspired emo accessories were facial piercings, especially snake bites or pierced lips, and occasionally wearing ties as well, which were all reminiscent of anti-mainstream and anti-fashion punk statements who were subverting traditional business clothing and the clean-cut facial looks. In terms of shoes, Vans were an essential accessory. This is partly because Vans, which were a key shoe of the 70s and 90s skateboard style, also sponsored the Warped Tour, which helped launch many emo bands in the 2000s. The most popular style was the slide-on, which first gained attention in the 80s after being seen on Stoner Jeff in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. Arguably more prevalent in the aesthetic were Converses, as another shoe often worn with skinny jeans by punks in the 70s. The Converse was used as a symbol of emo identity online, where it was normal to post highly saturated pictures of them covered in emo lyrics and adorned with checkered laces. Another common punk-inspired accessory was a crossover satchel bag, adorned in badges of your favourite bands or emo symbols, echoing the punk sentiment of covering clothing in symbolic badges. Outside of punk influences, emos loved a striped scarf, especially if it was long and skinny. Also, in the later 2000s, small lightweight scarves, usually kufiya scarves, were seen a lot. These scarves, especially kufiya, were a massive indie and alternative trend of the period overall, taking a scarf once associated with the Palestine resistance and Middle Eastern and North African cultures and turning it into a fashion symbol. This little moment of fashion history can be brought back to the Balenciaga's 2007 winter collection that featured this item. Then clothing stores began pumping them out everywhere, including Urban Outfitters, who got in trouble for referring to them as anti-war scarves. And lastly, emo took some accessory inspiration from the 90s to early 2000s emos and their vintage, hipster, geek chic inspired fashion, and incorporated things like horn-rimmed glasses and suspenders. Hair and beauty. Hair and beauty trends were the heart of the 2000s emo aesthetic, instantly signalling identity, attitude, and the subculture's raw emotional core. Across all genders, hair was usually long, jet black, and flat iron straight, with long sweeping hair bangs that covered the face. Girl emos frequently wore this style with their side bangs pinned back, and a lot of volume and shape at the top with thin and straight hair down the bottom. This took a lot of inspiration from scene hairstyles. There was also a version of this hair that included an upright spiked style at the crown of the head with a long side bang at the front. This was sometimes referred to as the gunshot wound. Similar to clothing that covered them up, many assumed these haircuts were popular in emo because they hid their faces, symbolic of low self-esteem and emotional pain. This could just be a stereotype though, as they were similar to 70s goth hairstyles and also likely drew inspiration from 90s emo and screamo bands such as Silverstein, Antioch Arrow, and Swing Kids. And the music video for hardcore band Refused 1998 song New Noise showcased a side-swept fringe that was a big moment for alternative music fashion. Because of the crossover with the scene aesthetic, emos were occasionally experimenting with bright colours, especially when using Manic Panic hair colour from Hot Topic. In terms of makeup, lots and lots of black eyeliner around the eyes was crucial. This was super popular in historic punk and goth styles, where dramatic unisex makeup was used to both create a striking look and subvert gender expectations. Smoked out dark colours like red echoed more goth influences, but was also heavily influenced by My Chemical Romance. Male emos, sometimes wearing guy liner, faced societal criticism for challenging traditional masculinity, a prejudice that was strengthened by them wearing black nail polish, but any emo, whatever gender, considered black nail polish essential to their look. Other visual cues. Symbols and motifs. Stripes and checks were probably the most iconic emo patterns, drawing from punk and more goth styles. But other common motifs included skulls, broken hearts, splatters, and glittery pictures edited on blingy, reflecting dark emotional themes, alternative influences, and broader McBling aesthetics. And while dark colours dominated the aesthetic, both symbolic of dark emotions and previous alternative subcultures, occasionally bright accents in clothing hinted at the scene-style crossover. Emo art that often appeared on their clothes included sketchy, jagged designs of emos with large exaggerated eyes and heads, largely inspired by Tim Burton, Death Note's L, and chibi anime styles. Then there was Pon and Z comics, which were created by Jeff Thomas in 2004 and spread like wildfire by emos on social media, who loved the signature dark and sometimes comical style. Finally, there was Hot Topic merchandise of other films, novels, or comic books, like The Night Before Christmas, or Emily the Strange. Emily's case is pretty interesting actually. Designed by Rob Rager, her dark and quirky vibe was not only perfect for more goth and emo fashion, but inspired the look of punk rock bands, celebrities, and even designers like Victoria Beckham during her 2012 spring collection, or those at Chanel, Gaultier, Marc Jacobs, and more in a 2003 V Magazine double-page spread. Brands. A number of brands are iconic 2000s emo. First, there is Pete Wentz of Fall Out Boy's brand, Clandestine, which first launched in 2006. It featured an iconic Bart skull logo, which was loved by emos. Other brands sold at Hot Topic, such as Bleeding Star, Akumi Inc., Iron Fist, especially after Jared Way's skeleton top went viral, and Rockette, which have all mostly become emo fossils by now, but are very nostalgic to those that were in the scene. Additionally, Kerrang! Magazine is considered by some to be the 2000s emo Bible. Technology. Being an aesthetic born from the internet, a number of 2000s technologies are key visual identifiers for the 2000s emo. Think iPods full of emo music, especially coloured iPod minis, photographs taken on digital cameras, especially mirror selfies and with specific poses, like widening your legs and leaning forward, or pushing your side bangs to the front of your face, or writing something on a piece of paper then taking a photo with it, or making the raw hand movement, which was more a scene thing but was still done by emos. These photographs were then uploaded to MySpace or LiveJournal, and the early 2000s rough and amateurish visuals on these platforms are so important for the aesthetic. Covering your MySpace or Bebo in emo motifs, song lyrics, band appreciation stuff, memes, artwork, and emo photo shoots with your friends, and smothering this stuff with the glittery animations of Blingy was a rite of passage for many 2000s emos. Additionally, choosing the right aim away message or lyrics for your MSN name, which usually had to sum up how you felt about your current crush, had zero chill and was extremely difficult to get right. In the later stage of the 2000s emo, Tumblr visuals of memes or song lyrics or emotional posts are also strong visual cues. The decline. The 2000s emo aesthetic began to decline shortly after 2010, as by 2013 many of the popular emo bands of the early parts of the decade had either lost their popularity, moved in a different direction, or just broken up. There are a number of factors that probably contributed to this, like the scene aesthetic surpassing emo in popularity, and alternative music trends of the late 2000s and early 2010s shifting towards hipster and indie sounds and new aesthetics. But honestly, I think Chris Payne explains it best in Where Are Your Boys Tonight? The Oral History of Emo's Mainstream Explosion, where he says that emo was largely a subculture for teenagers. But teenagers grow older and value different things and develop different interests, and with that, their subcultures just often die. It's also possible that a few issues with the emo aesthetic contributed to its declining influence. It was often associated with self-harm and unaliving ideation. Fingerless gloves, long-sleeved hoodies, razor blade necklaces, and stacked bracelets were often assumed to be worn to conceal or glorify self-inflicted injuries. This stereotype was amplified by media sensationalism. In 2006, the Daily Mail referred to emo as a cult of self-harm and unaliving ideation, framing the subculture as just plain dangerous. Interestingly, studies that have analysed emo's Facebook posts during the 2000s provide a mixed support of this. While one study found that the subculture normalised unaliving oneself, another reason that it was mostly a source of comfort and coping mechanisms for teenagers facing life challenges, and that it was actually discrimination against emos that was more likely contributing to their mental health issues than the subculture itself. And it has to be said, the emo aesthetic was subjected to significant discrimination during this time. At the height of its popularity, hate crimes towards emos had become a global issue. Russian lawmakers wanted to ban emo attire in schools and government buildings in 2008, calling the clothing a dangerous teenage trend. The same year, anti-emo groups attacked teenagers in Mexico City and Tijuana, criticizing their androgynous, non-traditional appearances. Then, horrifically, in 2012, reports of Shia militias killing emos in Iraq surfaced. During this time, the Baghdad Morality Police, those in charge of enforcing modest dressing, published a statement that criticized emo's clothing, labeling it strange and satanic, and it was understood that emos were being targeted for appearing gay. This is heartbreaking, especially as the emo aesthetic was known to help queer youth safely explore not only their queer identity, but their individuality. Dr. Brian Peters, a queer studies professor, writes in Emo Gay Boys and Subculture, Post-Punk Queer Youth and Rethinking Images of Masculinity, that as queer other, the emo genre, his clothing, his hair, and his accessories, creates his own desired autonomy, his own construction of the self that differentiates him from other young men, both queer and straight. However, when it came to heterosexual emo relationships, the androgynous look was criticized by some scholars. Sam Du Bois, a professor of musicology, argues that the aesthetic helped emo boys engage in beta male misogyny, where they portrayed themselves as the better choice for women because of their emotionality compared to stereotypical masculinity, but this only reinforced women as a commodity for male competition. And then Emily Riles, a Cal Poly gender studies professor, labelled emo's androgynous look as performative progressivism in her essay Emo Angst, Machoism, and Masculinity in Crisis. She argues that emo boys, while appearing vulnerable and emotional in their appearance, actually often perpetuated misogyny by portraying women as manipulative or cruel in lyrics and online forums, and engaging in reflexive sadomachoism, where, on the one hand, emos are constructed as being victimized for embracing feminine and gay cultures. On the other hand, emos victimize their feminine selves, as well as girls whom they present as the primary roots of their problems. So it's complicated, as all aesthetics are really. But what's really interesting here is, despite all these issues, 2000s emo never really entirely disappeared. Throughout the 2010s, platforms like Tumblr and Twitch helped sustain emo's visual legacy, particularly through the rise of e-girls and e-boys. And emo aesthetics and sounds began to permeate hip-hop in the mid-2010s, with artists like Lil Peep, Juice WRLD, and XXXTentacion. And emo fashion is still influencing hip-hop today. You also had the rise of emo nights and later the When We Were Young festival, where those who used to be a part of the scene gathered for nostalgia. And in more recent years, you've seen artists like Billie Eilish, Willow Smith, Halsey, and Machine Gun Kelly all draw so much inspiration from this period of fashion and music. It also has a proportion of Gen Zers in a chokehold on TikTok, as they have access to internet archives of not just 2000s emo, but all of its predecessors and its successors. I think 2020s emo is becoming a fascinating blend of all previous versions of emo. That's a video for another time, but interestingly, Vogue just labelled emo style as the new indie sleaze in 2024. Once again, everybody, the internet is shaping what it means to dress emo, and the big industries are taking notice. And all of this just makes it clear, the 2000s emo aesthetic resonates with people on such a deep level, and however you feel about it, you cannot deny the cultural impact it's had on youth. It's one of those aesthetics that has just soaked itself into the fabric of the 21st century as a whole. And I think I get why. I mean, I got emotional making this video multiple times. I wasn't an emo in my youth, but I was around when all of these songs were massive on the radio, and going back and listening to those lyrics again and seeing the way it resonated with people, yeah, it got to me. And I just find it fascinating that the emo aesthetic is a way for people to use clothes to present some of their deepest and most vulnerable emotions. Like all the aesthetics I've examined, it's just so much more than clothing. So what do you think of the 2000s emo aesthetic? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
So I was walking along today and I saw a dead bird, and it was just it was a sign of, the entropy in our society and how everything is falling apart, and birds are dying. I mean, birds are dying.